The Engine of Fate. In the quiet, mist-covered town of Carrington, nestled between the jagged hills and dense forests, lived a man who had never been understood by the people around him. He was not a mysterious figure in the traditional sense, but his brilliance in the world of engineering seemed to separate him from everyone else. His name was Thomas Winters. He was a man of sharp intellect, a perfectionist in his work, and a dreamer who believed that innovation was the key to unlocking the future. But in Carrington, where traditions held stronger than new ideas, Thomas had always been an outsider. His obsession with improving the world through machines had earned him the nickname, the Mad Inventor, from the villagers. Thomas didn't mind the label. He didn't care for the opinions of others. All that mattered to him was his work, his engine. One crisp autumn evening, as the wind howled through the trees and the rain began to fall in sheets against a small workshop, Thomas stared at the engine on his workbench. The light from his lamp flickered, casting long, eerie shadows around the cluttered room. It was the engine of his dreams, or perhaps his nightmares. He had spent years on it, tweaking, adjusting, and improving it. But there was something about it that still eluded him. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. His heart raced with frustration, not from the pressure of deadlines or the expectations of others, but from the relentless urge to make his invention perfect. He believed that this engine could change everything. It could change the world, push mankind forward, and make energy and transportation more efficient than ever before. If only he could get it right. If only the pieces would fall into place. But there was something else, something darker, that had begun to cloud his thoughts. He wasn't the only one who had been obsessed with engines. The stories of his father, a brilliant but broken inventor who had mysteriously disappeared years ago, echoed in his mind. His father had shared similar dreams and similar obsessions, and some whispered that his disappearance wasn't as simple as it seemed. Perhaps the man had found something forbidden in his quest for greatness, something that drove him away, or worse, drove him mad. As Thomas sat in his dimly lit workshop, his thoughts wandered to those long-ago stories. He could almost hear his father's voice, could almost feel his presence in the room. A strange sensation filled his chest, an overwhelming mixture of grief and curiosity. What had his father discovered? What had he done? Without warning, the lamp above him flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. For a moment, the world stood still. The sound of the rain outside intensified, the storm rattling the windows like a chorus of whispers. And then, in the quiet, he heard it, the unmistakable sound of a footstep. Thomas jumped from his seat, heart pounding. His workshop was isolated. No one could have been there. Or could they? He shook the thought away, telling himself it was just the storm, playing tricks on his mind. But the unease lingered, gnawing at him. He reached for the matchbox and struck a match, the small flame casting an eerie glow. It was then that he noticed something that hadn't been there before. On the workbench, beside the engine, lay a note. It was simple, but its presence was unsettling. No signature, no name, just a message. "Don't finish it, Thomas. It's not meant for you." Thomas's breath caught in his throat. Who had written this? How did they know about the engine? He stood there frozen, staring at the note. His mind raced with 1,000 questions, but one dominated them all. What did it mean? What was he being warned against? As the storm raged outside, Thomas's curiosity overcame his fear. He couldn't ignore the message. It was a challenge, a mystery he had to solve. His heart told him to destroy the engine, to abandon this dangerous pursuit. But his mind, ever the inventor, could not let it go. What was hidden within this engine? What could it do that was so dangerous? It was a decision that would change everything. Over the next few days, Thomas became consumed by the engine and the note. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't think of anything but the warning. He knew that he needed help, someone to share his burden, someone who might see the situation from a different perspective. And that person came in the form of Sarah, a young woman who had recently moved to Carrington. Sarah was an outsider too. She had come from the city to escape the ghosts of her past, to find peace in a quiet town. Her life had been filled with loss and hardship, and she had arrived in Carrington searching for something, though she didn't know what. When she met Thomas, it was as if a spark ignited in both of them. There was an immediate connection, something inexplicable, as if their destinies had intertwined long before they had met. She was intelligent, kind, and curious, and there was something about her that made Thomas feel understood in a way he hadn't before. He invited Sarah to his workshop, hoping that she might be able to offer some insight into the mystery of the engine and the ominous note. She agreed, intrigued by his story and the intense energy that surrounded him. As she stepped into the workshop, the first thing Sarah noticed was the weight of the air. It was thick with tension, with something unseen pressing against the walls. The engine on the workbench seemed to hum with a life of its own, its metallic surface gleaming under the flickering light. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once. "Thomas," she said softly, stepping closer to the engine. "What have you done?" "I don't know," he replied, his voice distant. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do, but I have to finish it. I have to know what it can do." Sarah hesitated, then placed a hand on his arm. What if the answer isn't in finishing it? What if the answer is in letting it go? Thomas's heart clenched at her words. He knew she was right. He knew the warning he had received was no coincidence. But the pull of the engine, the desire to see it succeed, was too strong. He had been raised with the belief that nothing was impossible, that perseverance was the key to unlocking the future. But in that moment, he wondered if that belief had led him down a dangerous path. A sudden chill filled the room, and the air seemed to thicken further. The temperature dropped, and Sarah shivered. "Do you feel that?" she whispered, eyes wide. Before Thomas could respond, the door to the workshop slammed shut. A loud bang echoed through the room, shaking the walls. The engine on the workbench let out a low, guttural sound, like a growl, vibrating with an energy that seemed unnatural. Something was wrong. The lights flickered, and in the darkness, Sarah's eyes widened as a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a man, but not like any man they had ever seen. His skin was pale, almost translucent, his eyes black as coal. He was tall, unnaturally tall, and his presence filled the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. "Thomas Winters," the figure spoke in a voice that seemed to reverberate from every corner of the room. "You have no idea what you've unleashed." Thomas's blood ran cold. He had seen this figure before, in his dreams, in his nightmares. It was his father. "Father?" Thomas whispered, his voice trembling. The figure nodded slowly. "I warned you. I warned you that the path you are on would lead to destruction. But you couldn't listen. Now you must face the consequences." The engine hummed louder, the noise deafening. The figure extended a hand, and the shadows around them deepened, swirling like a vortex. "This is the engine of fate," the figure continued. "It was never meant to be built. It was never meant to be finished. But you have defied the natural order, and now you will pay the price." Thomas could feel the ground beneath him tremble, as if the very foundation of the world was shifting. The engine pulsed with an energy that seemed alive, pulling him in, consuming him. It was no longer just a machine, it was a gateway, a portal to something beyond. He turned to Sarah, his heart breaking. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "No," she replied, her voice strong. "You don't have to do this. Let it go." But it was too late. The engine whined, and with a final, earth-shattering roar, it erupted into a blinding light. The workshop disappeared, and for a moment, Thomas felt as if he were floating in nothingness. But then, slowly, the light faded, and he found himself standing in a place unlike any he had ever seen. It was a world both familiar and alien, a place where time and space seemed to bend and twist. And there, in the distance, was his father. "Welcome to the other side," his father said, his voice gentle. "You've crossed the threshold, Thomas. But the question remains, what will you do now?" The engine had been more than a machine. It was a bridge to another realm, a realm where the boundaries between reality and fantasy no longer existed. It was a place of infinite possibilities and infinite dangers. And it was here that Thomas would find his true purpose, his redemption, or his doom. As he stood there, holding Sarah's hand, he realized that the journey had only just begun. And no matter what came next, he would face it with the courage to change, to grow, and to understand the true meaning of creation. In the end, it was not the engine that mattered. It was the choices they made, the connections they formed, and the legacy they left behind. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was the greatest invention of all.
Whispering echoes.